Elias, a young sculptor, craved inspiration. He had been struggling with a creative block for months, unable to find the spark that once fueled his passion. His studio, once a place of vibrant creativity, now felt like a prison of unfinished projects and discarded ideas. One day, while wandering through the narrow streets of the old town, he stumbled upon a dusty antique shop. The shop was filled with relics of the past, each item telling its own story. As he browsed through the cluttered shelves, something caught his eye. A strikingly realistic mannequin. The mannequin's lifelike glass eyes seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was as if the mannequin had a soul of its own, trapped within its inanimate form. Elias felt an inexplicable connection to it, a sense that this mannequin could be the key to unlocking his creativity. He knew he had to have it. The mannequin was perfect for his studio, a silent muse that could inspire him in ways he had never imagined. He envisioned it standing in the center of his workspace, a constant reminder of the beauty and mystery he sought to capture in his art. Without hesitation, Elias paid the shopkeeper and took his new muse home. The shopkeeper, an old man with a knowing smile, watched him leave with a look of curiosity and perhaps a hint of amusement. Back in his studio, Elias carefully positioned the mannequin in the center of the room. He adjusted its stance, making sure it stood tall and proud, as if it were a living being, posing for a portrait. The mannequin became the focal point of his studio, drawing his attention and igniting his imagination. It was as if the mannequin had a magnetic presence, pulling him out of his creative slump and into a world of endless possibilities. Elias began to work on a new sculpture with a renewed sense of purpose. His hands moved with a confidence he hadn't felt in months, shaping the clay with precision and passion. He felt a surge of creativity, inspired by the mannequin's presence. Ideas flowed freely, and his studio once again buzzed with the energy of creation. But as the days passed, Elias couldn't shake off a growing sense of unease. There was something about the mannequin that unsettled him, a feeling that he was being watched. He often caught himself glancing at it, only to find its glass eyes staring back at him with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. The mannequin, his once inspiring muse, now seemed to hold a dark and mysterious secret. Days turned into nights. Elias lost himself in his work. He often found himself staring at the mannequin. Its stillness was unnerving. He noticed small, unexplainable details. The mannequin's arm seemed to have shifted slightly. Its head appeared tilted at a different angle. Elias dismissed these as tricks of the light, shadows playing on his mind. He continued sculpting, trying to ignore the growing unease in his gut. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Elias set up a camera. He had always been fascinated by the unseen, the mysteries that lurked just beyond the edge of perception. Tonight, he was determined to uncover one such mystery. He needed to know the truth. For weeks, he had felt an eerie presence in his studio, a sensation that something was watching him. It was time to confront his fears. He pointed the lens directly at the mannequin. This mannequin had been a silent witness to his creative process, but lately it seemed to have a life of its own. He left it recording overnight. The red light blinked steadily, a silent guardian in the dark room. Elias hoped the camera would capture what his eyes could not. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. His blood ran cold. He had expected to see nothing, maybe a flicker of light or a shadow. But what he saw was far more disturbing. The footage showed the mannequin's head turning. It was not a trick of the light or a glitch in the recording. The head moved with a deliberate, almost human-like motion. It was slow and subtle, but undeniable. Each frame revealed a slight shift, a movement that was impossible to ignore. The mannequin was alive in some inexplicable way. Elias felt a shiver down his spine. The room seemed to close in around him, the air thick with an unspoken dread. He was no longer alone in his studio. He couldn't believe his eyes. The footage was clear. The mannequin had moved. It was as if it had a mind of its own, a silent observer that had finally decided to reveal itself. He was no longer dealing with tricks of the light. This was real. The evidence was irrefutable, and it sent a chill through his very soul. What did this mean? What was he dealing with? And he had it on camera. This was no longer just a feeling or a suspicion. It was documented, undeniable proof. Elias knew he had to dig deeper to understand the true nature of the mannequin's eerie movements. Sleep became a luxury Elias could not afford. Each night, the events grew stranger. He would wake to find objects moved. His tools were misplaced, drawings scattered across the floor. The mannequin seemed to be closer every time he opened his eyes. One night, Elias woke up from a nightmare. He felt a cold presence in the room. His heart pounded in his chest. His eyes darted to the mannequin. It was just inches from his bed. Its lifeless eyes stared at him. The studio became a place of fear. Elias saw things in the corner of his eye. His reflection in the mirror lagged behind his movements. He felt a constant, unseen presence. The mannequin was toying with him. He was living in a nightmare. His fear morphed into a terrifying certainty. He wasn't imagining things. The mannequin was alive. It was playing a sinister game, and he was trapped in its world. Elias couldn't take it anymore. He decided to get rid of the mannequin. He carried it out of his studio and dumped it in a back alley. He returned home, hoping for a peaceful night's sleep. He lay in bed, trying to convince himself he was safe. But the fear lingered. The feeling of being watched intensified. He tossed and turned, unable to shake off the dread. He knew, deep down, that he had made a terrible mistake. The next morning, Elias checked the security footage from his studio. He had been restless all night, haunted by the eerie events that had unfolded. The only way to put his mind at ease was to see the evidence for himself. He needed to see the mannequin gone to reassure himself. The thought of it still being there, standing ominously in the corner, was too much to bear. His hands trembled as he navigated through the footage. But what he saw on the screen made his blood run cold. His heart pounded in his chest as he leaned closer to the monitor, unable to believe his eyes. The room was empty, devoid of any presence. The footage from the night before showed the studio empty, completely empty. There was no sign of the mannequin, no indication that it had ever been there. The room was as still as a graveyard. The mannequin had never been there. Elias felt a chill run down his spine. How could this be? He distinctly remembered placing it there, its lifeless eyes staring back at him. Not in the footage from the previous night, not ever. He rewound the footage, playing it back frame by frame, searching for any clue, any sign that he wasn't losing his mind. He was losing his mind. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Had he imagined it all? Was his mind playing tricks on him? The stress and exhaustion were taking their toll. He had imagined it all, or so he thought. He sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of the situation. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. But then, in the corner of the screen, a figure flickered past the doorway. It was barely visible, just a shadowy blur. But it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. It was gone, in a flash. He rewound the footage. His fingers moved frantically, desperate to catch another glimpse of the mysterious figure. What was it? Who was it? Zoomed in. It was him. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. He was the one in the footage, carrying the mannequin into his studio. But how? When? He was carrying the mannequin into his studio. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. But the picture they formed was more terrifying than he could have ever imagined.